Out in the empty heart of Wyoming, where the wind speaks in tongues and the horizon is a blade that can cut a soul in two, a woman heard a scream. This wasn't the shriek of a hawk or the cry of a cougar. It was human. It was a child. And for Cordelia Stone, a widow clinging to her dead husband's land like a ghost, that single sound was about to change everything. She thought she was about to perform an act of mercy. She had no idea she was actually lighting the fuse on a powder keg of ancient honor, brutal survival, and a blood debt so deep it could only be paid one way. She was about to find out that out here, the only thing more dangerous than a predator is a promise. The first scream cut through the dusk like a razor. Cordelia Stone froze. Her hand was on the Winchester rifle propped against her cabin wall, the wood worn smooth by her husband's grip. It was the only thing of his that still felt warm. Out here, miles from anywhere you could call a town, a child's cry meant one of two things: a family in trouble, or a trap. Men far worse than wolves roamed these hills. Men who would use the sound of a helpless child to lure a lonely woman out of her home. For a widow holding on to a legacy one ragged breath at a time, the line between compassion and survival was thin enough to bleed on. But then another sob tore through the twilight, weaker this time, followed by a racking cough. It wasn't a trick. It was real. And Cordelia knew in that gut-wrenching moment she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't let a child die out there in the dark. That one decision, that single act of mercy, would set her on a collision course with a proud, ancient people. It would ignite a firestorm of obligation and honor. She had no way of knowing it yet, but she was about to trade her loneliness for a cage. The wind was a constant beast in the Bighorn Basin, a whining, scouring thing that frayed the nerves and stripped the land bare. It was the voice of her solitude, a year-long funeral dirge since she'd put Jedediah in the ground on the small rise overlooking their homestead. Her world was this cabin, chinked with mud and hope, a small barn with a mean-spirited mule named Absalom, and a vegetable patch that was a daily war against rocks and rabbits. Every log in that cabin held the ghost of her husband's touch. Jedediah had seen a future here. She just saw hardship. A swift, merciless fever had taken him, leaving Cordelia with nothing but his dream and the grit she'd scraped together from her own hard life. She wasn't a big woman, but she was tough as cured leather. Her hands, calloused and stained, could soothe a nervous mule, aim a rifle, and stitch a wound with equal skill. Her face was a map of her 30 years, creases around her blue eyes from squinting into the sun, a firm set to her jaw that spoke of sorrows she didn't talk about. Tonight was supposed to be like any other. Mend a fence post Absalom had used for scratching, check the empty snares, huddle inside with the smell of bacon grease and coffee, a small shield against the crushing loneliness of the night. That's when she heard it. The sound was so foreign, so utterly out of place, she thought the wind was playing tricks on her, weaving the cries of predators into a phantom of human misery. She stood stock still, the iron skillet heavy in her hand, her head cocked. The wind died for a moment, and in the sudden ringing silence, the sound came again, clearer this time. A wail, a child's wail, full of fear and pain. Jedediah's voice echoed in her memory, a low, cautious rumble. Out here, Cora, your ears are your best guards. Don't ever trust a sound you can't place. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It could be a Shoshone trick, or worse, renegades. Men who'd abandoned all law and decency, who'd use any lure to draw out a lone homesteader. She walked to the cabin's single window, peering through the wavy, imperfect glass into the deepening indigo of the twilight. The land was empty, a rumpled blanket of sagebrush and rock falling away toward the dark slash of Cottonwood Creek. The cry came again, weaker this time, punctuated by that gut-wrenching cough. It wasn't a lure, it was real. The sound snagged something deep inside her, a maternal instinct she thought had withered and died long ago. Damnation, she whispered, the word a puff of steam in the cool cabin air. She was a fool, a complete and utter fool. But she couldn't leave a child to the coyotes. Not tonight. They'd been getting bolder, their yips and howls growing closer with each sunset. Decision made, she moved with the economy of a woman who never wasted emotion. The skillet went on the cold stove. She pulled on a thick wool coat, checked the load in the Winchester 73 that had been Jedediah's pride and joy. She trusted it more than any man left alive. Grabbing a lantern and a pouch with a flask of water and some dried venison, she unbarred the door. The cold air hit her like a slap. The wind had picked up again, carrying the scent of dust and distant pine. She held the lantern high, its yellow glow pushing back the darkness in a small, trembling circle. "Hello?" she called out, her voice feeling small against the vastness. "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered. She listened again, straining. The crying had stopped. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Had she been too slow? She started walking, following the sound toward the creek bed. The terrain was treacherous, littered with loose rock and thorny brush that snagged at her skirts. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a lurking shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. She found him 20 minutes later. He was huddled in a shallow washout, a small boy, no older than 5 or 6. His skin was the color of polished copper, his hair a tangle of straight black. He wore only a simple loincloth and moccasins, wholly unprepared for the night's chill. He was shivering violently, his face streaked with tears and dirt. When her lantern light fell on him, he flinched and pressed himself deeper into the earth, his dark eyes wide with terror. He was Shoshone. "It's all right," Cordelia said softly, keeping her voice low and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you." She set the lantern down and knelt, keeping a respectful distance. She held out her hand, palm up, a gesture of peace. The boy just stared, his small body trembling. She could see now that his leg was scraped raw, and a feverish glaze coated his eyes. He was hurt. He was sick, and he was utterly alone. But as she moved to help him, a different sound reached her, a low, guttural growl from the darkness just beyond her ring of light. Cordelia's head snapped up. Her blood ran cold. She didn't need to see them to know what they were. The faint, musky scent of canine hit her nostrils. From the shadows a pair of yellow eyes gleamed, then another pair, and another. A coyote, bolder than the rest, trotted into the light, its lips peeled back in a silent snarl. It was lean and mangy, hunger radiating from it like a foul heat. Two more fanned out on its flanks, their forms ghostly and silent. A pack. They had been drawn by the same sound she had, but with a far different intent. They had been waiting patiently for the small, weak prey to fall silent. Her heart was a drum against her ribs. She couldn't grab the boy and run. They were too close, and he was in no condition to move quickly. Her only option was to stand her ground, here in this lonely washout, with a feverish child of a people who likely saw her as an invader. "Get back!" she hissed, her voice a low threat. She raised the rifle, the smooth wood of the stock familiar and comforting against her cheek. The lead coyote took another step, lowering its head, its tail stiff. It was testing her. Cordelia didn't hesitate. She aimed and fired. The explosion of the Winchester was deafening. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. The lead coyote yelped, a choked, surprised sound as it spun and dropped, kicking in the dust before falling still. The other two scattered back into the darkness, but she knew they weren't gone. The smell of blood would only make them crazier. She quickly worked the lever action, the slick metallic shuck-shuck, a sound of deadly promise. She ejected the spent casing and chambered a new round. The boy behind her let out a terrified whimper. "Stay quiet, child," she ordered, not taking her eyes off the oppressive darkness. "Stay right behind me." For a long minute, there was only the wind and her own ragged breathing, then a blur of motion from her right. She swung the rifle, firing from the hip, a desperate prayer in the dark. A yelp of pain told her she'd hit something, but from the left, the third coyote charged. It came in low and fast, a gray streak of feral hunger. She didn't have time to aim. She sidestepped, swinging the heavy rifle like a club. The steel barrel connected with the animal's head with a sickening crack. It tumbled past her, stunned and snarling, scrambling to regain its footing. It lunged again, this time for her leg. She cried out as its teeth, sharp as needles, tore through her skirt and into the flesh of her calf. The pain was white-hot, electric. She stumbled back, kicking out with her other foot, connecting with the animal's ribs. It released her, and before it could recover, she brought the butt of the rifle down hard on its spine. It went limp. She stood panting, her legs screaming in agony, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. She scanned the darkness, listening. Nothing. The immediate threat was over. She limped back to the boy, who was now staring at her with an expression of stunned awe. He looked from her to the dead animals, then back to her. Ignoring the throbbing in her calf, she scooped him up into her arms. He weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sharp bones and shivering muscle. His head lolled against her shoulder, his breathing shallow. He was burning up with fever. She grabbed her lantern and the rifle and began the slow, painful trek back to the cabin. Every step was a fresh wave of agony. The boy in her arms was a strange weight, a burden she had chosen that might yet be her undoing. She had fought off the predators of the wild, but she had a sinking feeling that the most dangerous part of her night was just beginning. Back in the cabin, she gently laid the boy on a cot. He was unconscious, his breathing a faint rasp. First, she had to tend to her own wound. Gritting her teeth, she lifted her dress. The coyote's teeth had left 4 deep puncture wounds in her calf. Infection was the real enemy now. It could kill as surely as a bullet. She moved with grim purpose, cleaning the wound with carbolic acid and water. The pain was an exercise in pure agony. She bit down on a strip of leather, tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't make a sound. She couldn't afford the weakness. Finally, she poured a searing trickle of whiskey directly into the wounds. Her vision swam. She stitched the deepest tear closed and wrapped her calf tightly in clean linen. Only then did she turn to the boy. She sponged his face and chest with cool water, trying to bring the fever down. He muttered in a language she didn't understand. She cleaned and bandaged the deep scrape on his leg, applying a salve of comfrey and yarrow. She managed to trickle a little water between his lips. Exhausted, she pulled a chair to the side of the cot and sat, the Winchester within arm's reach. The night wore on. Who was he? Where were his people? And what would they think when they found him here? The questions churned in her mind. She was an intruder on this land. The Shoshone had every reason to despise her. By saving their child, had she just signed her own death warrant? Dawn broke gray and cold. The boy's fever had broken. He was sleeping peacefully. Cordelia felt a sliver of relief. She stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. She was standing by the stove when a shadow fell across the window. Her hand went instantly to the Winchester. She moved to the side of the window, peering out. Her blood turned to ice. They were there. At least 20 of them, maybe more, spread out in a silent, menacing semicircle around her cabin. They were on horseback, proud and still as statues. Warriors. Their faces were grim, their bodies adorned with the symbols of their tribe. They held lances, bows, and a few carried rifles that looked suspiciously like army issue. This was not a search party. This was a war party. At their head sat a man who could only be their chief. He was older, his face a mask of deeply etched lines that spoke of authority and sorrow. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that cascaded down his back. His eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed on her cabin door. He radiated an aura of immense, coiled power. Cordelia's mouth went dry. This was it. They believed she had stolen the child. The dead coyotes would mean nothing. Her word against theirs. She had 2 choices. Stay inside and be burned out, or walk out and face them. She looked at the sleeping boy, then at the heavy bar on her door. Jedediah had built this cabin to withstand a blizzard, but not an assault. Staying inside was just a slower death. Taking a deep breath, she laid the Winchester on the table, a clear sign she was not seeking a fight. She walked to the door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She lifted the heavy bar. The screech of the door opening was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Cordelia stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the morning light. She kept her hands open and away from her body. The pain in her calf was a sharp, grounding reality. A collective murmur went through the assembled warriors. The chief's gaze was intense, unreadable. He scanned her from head to toe, his eyes lingering for a moment on the bloodstain on her skirt and the makeshift bandage visible beneath. She held his gaze, refusing to look away. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. The chief spoke, his voice deep and resonant, a string of guttural words she could not understand. He was making a demand. Cordelia simply nodded toward the open cabin door. An invitation. It was a terrifying gamble. The chief considered this for a long moment. Then with a subtle hand gesture, he signaled for his warriors to remain. He slid from his magnificent Appaloosa horse and moved with a surprising grace. As he approached the porch, another, younger warrior dismounted and followed a few paces behind. This one was different. He was tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes, black and cold as river stones, held a chilling hostility. Where the chief's face held sorrowful authority, this man's held only suspicion. A long, shaded scar ran from his temple to his jaw, giving him a perpetually grim expression. This was a man who lived with violence. The chief stopped at the foot of the steps. He looked into Cordelia's eyes, and for the first time, she saw past the authority to the raw grief beneath. She saw the eyes of a father who had feared the worst. He spoke again, slower this time, gesturing toward the cabin. Cordelia stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The younger warrior moved to follow, but Cordelia put up a hand, stopping him. She looked him directly in the eye, then shook her head slightly. The chief, yes. You, no. It was an audacious move, a challenge to his status. But her instinct screamed that letting this cold-eyed man into her home was a mistake. The warrior's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief and anger in their depths. He took a half-step forward, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. But the chief, from just inside the doorway, spoke a sharp, single word. The warrior froze, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He glared at Cordelia with pure hatred before stepping back. Inside, the chief walked to the cot. He stood over the sleeping boy, his broad back to Cordelia. He looked down at his son for a long time. Then very gently he reached out and touched the boy's forehead. He felt the absence of fever. He saw the clean bandage on his leg. He saw the peaceful sleep. His shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, slumped slightly. A sound, half sigh, half groan escaped his lips. The sound of a father's heart breaking with relief. He turned around. He looked at the stitched and bandaged wound on Cordelia's calf. He looked at the 3 dead coyotes she had dragged and left near her woodpile. His gaze swept the cabin, taking in the single cot, the sparse furnishings, the profound solitude of the place. He walked back to the doorway and looked Cordelia in the eye. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something far more complex. Gratitude, respect, and a deep, profound sense of debt. He spoke, and though she didn't know the words, the meaning was clear. It was a statement of thanks. He pointed to his son, then to her, and then to the sky. He was acknowledging a great deed, a life saved. Then he turned and walked out. He spoke to the hostile young warrior, who still simmered with resentment. The chief mounted his horse, gave Cordelia one last long look, and then, with a command, turned his war party around. They rode away as silently as they had come, melting back into the vast landscape, leaving Cordelia alone on her porch, her leg throbbing, her mind reeling. She had survived, for now. But as she watched them disappear, she saw the look the young, scarred warrior gave her over his shoulder. It was not a look of gratitude. It was a look of cold promise. This was not over. The debt had been acknowledged, but the payment had not yet been made. And Cordelia had the terrifying feeling that the price would be far higher than she could possibly comprehend. For 2 days, an unnerving silence settled over the homestead. The wind still blew, and Absalom the mule still complained, but the oppressive weight of the warrior's presence was gone. Cordelia tried to fall back into her routine, but it was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden watcher. Every snap of a twig sent her hand flying to the Winchester. She was a prisoner in her own home, trapped not by bars but by a knowing uncertainty. The Shoshone boy, who she learned through simple gestures was called Tikna, or Little Fawn, was her constant companion. His initial terror was replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. They had no common language, but they managed. He would point to the coffee pot, and she would say, "Coffee." He would repeat the word, a small, perfect echo. He followed her everywhere, a small, dark-haired shadow. He helped her feed Absalom, giggling when the mule nudged him with its soft nose. In these small moments, Cordelia felt a warmth she hadn't realized she'd been missing so desperately. The silence of her cabin was no longer empty, but the peace was fragile, a thin pane of glass waiting to be shattered. She knew they would be back. The chief, Black Otter, had not struck her as a man who left debts unpaid. The end of the second day brought them. She saw the dust cloud on the horizon long before she could make out the riders. This time it was different. It wasn't a war party, it was a procession. They came not with the grim silence of warriors, but with a slow, deliberate ceremony. Chief Black Otter led them. At his side rode the scarred warrior, his face as implacable as ever. Cordelia had learned his name from Tikna, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. Kiat, hawk that flies alone. Behind them came others, leading pack horses laden with goods. Tikna, seeing them from the window, let out a joyful cry. "Eight!" he shouted, pointing. "Father!" Cordelia's heart sank. The reprieve was over. She placed a reassuring hand on Tikna's shoulder and opened the door. Tikna ran straight into Black Otter's arms as the chief dismounted. The chief held his son tightly, his stoic facade melting away for a moment in a display of pure, paternal love. Kiat watched the scene, his expression unreadable, his gaze then shifting to Cordelia, cold and measuring. He saw not a savior, but a complication. Black Otter set Tikna down and approached Cordelia. With him was an older man, his face a web of wrinkles, a shaman or an elder. The elder began to speak in Shoshone, his hands moving in eloquent, descriptive gestures. He pointed to Tikna, then to the sky, then to the ground, indicating the boy's spirit had been halfway between the living world and the next. He then pointed to Cordelia and to the dead coyotes, making a motion of a fierce fight. He was telling the story of that night. Then at a signal from the chief, the procession moved forward. Warriors began to unload the pack horses, laying gifts upon the dusty ground in front of her cabin. Cordelia watched in stunned silence. First came horses, not old nags, but 5 magnificent ponies. And leading them, a 6th horse that took her breath away. A paint stallion, muscular and proud, with one startling blue eye. It was a king among horses. Next came robes, buffalo hides tanned to the softness of velvet, decorated with intricate quill work. There were beaver pelts and fox furs, a small mountain of wealth that would fetch a fortune at any trading post. Finally, they laid down artifacts, a shield decorated with eagle feathers, a powerful bow made of horn, and most startling of all, a brand new, gleaming Henry repeating rifle, far superior to her own Winchester. Cordelia was speechless. This was more than a thank you. It was a king's ransom. It was too much. "No," she said, shaking her head, finding her voice. I cannot accept this. I did what anyone would have done." The elder paused, frowning in confusion. Black Otter's expression hardened slightly. To refuse a gift of this magnitude was a grave insult. The elder tried again, using a few broken English words mixed with gestures. "You save son of chief," he said, pointing to Tikna. "Great spirit, strong heart. You are good woman, strong woman." "Thank you," Cordelia said, "but this is too much. Please take them back. My only reward is seeing the boy is safe." A tense silence fell. Kiat, who had been watching with detached contempt, let out a short, humorless laugh. He spoke a sharp phrase in Shoshone to his father. Black Otter silenced him with a glare. The chief stepped forward himself. He looked directly into Cordelia's eyes, willing her to understand. He pointed to the gifts, then to her. Then he pointed to his people. He was trying to explain that this was a matter of honor, not just for him, but for the entire tribe. The debt had to be paid and seen to be paid. Then came the moment that ripped her world from its moorings. Black Otter put a hand on his own chest. 8, he said, identifying himself. He then pointed to Kiati. "Kiat, my son." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he made a gesture that was universally understood across all cultures and languages. He linked his 2 index fingers together. A union. A marriage. He pointed at the mountain of gifts. Then he pointed at Cordelia. And then he pointed directly at his son, Kiat. The blood drained from Cordelia's face. Her mind reeled, unable to process the implication. The horses, the furs, the rifle. It wasn't a gift of gratitude, it was a bride price. They weren't just thanking her, they were buying her. They were offering her all this wealth in exchange for her hand in marriage. Not to the grateful chief, but to the cold, hostile warrior who looked at her as if she were something he'd scraped off his boot. No, she whispered, the word catching in her throat. She looked at Kiat. His face was a mask of stone, but she could see the fury burning in his dark eyes. He was as much a victim in this as she was. His pride, his freedom, being bartered by his father to a white woman he despised. This wasn't an honor to him, it was a cage. She backed away, shaking her head frantically. No, I am a widow. My husband is buried on that hill. I will not marry again. I will not marry him. She pointed a trembling finger at Kiati. A collective gasp went through the Shoshone. Her refusal was blunt, public, and deeply shaming. To refuse the son of the chief, to reject such a lavish price, was to declare them and their customs worthless. The atmosphere curdled from solemn ceremony to raw anger. Black Otter's face darkened with a sorrowful rage. He had made the highest possible offer of honor to this woman who had saved his bloodline. He had offered to bind her strength to theirs, to make her one of the people. And she had spat on it. Kiat took a step forward, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he spoke to his father. He was clearly demanding to be released from this humiliation. Cordelia's terror solidified into defiant anger. I am not for sale, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, though her body trembled. I saved your son because he was a child, alone and afraid, not to be sold like a horse. She turned and fled back into the safety of her cabin, slamming the door and dropping the heavy bar. She leaned against it, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had just turned an act of mercy into a declaration of war. Outside, she could hear angry shouts and the deep, commanding voice of the chief. She had fought off coyotes, but in her ignorance, she had stumbled into the jaws of a far more dangerous trap, the rigid, unyielding jaws of tribal honor. And this time, no rifle could save her. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. Peeking through a crack in the shutters, Cordelia saw them leaving. But they did not take the bride price with them. The magnificent horses, the furs, the rifle, they remained. A glittering, insulting testament to her refusal, staked out in front of her cabin like a siege line. They were leaving the offer on the table, a constant, silent pressure, and two warriors remained behind, posted like sentinels at a distance, watching her cabin. She was no longer just a homesteader, she was a prisoner. The next few days were a living hell. She was trapped. She couldn't work her land, check her snares, or even fetch water from the creek without the cold, unblinking stares of the Shoshone guards following her every move. Tikna was her only comfort, but his presence was also a constant, painful reminder of the trouble she was in. He seemed to understand that he was the cause of her confinement, and he grew quiet and subdued. Cordelia's anger warred with her fear. How dare they? How dare they try to own her, to pay for her like a piece of livestock? Her heart was buried on that hill with Jedediah, and it wasn't for sale at any price. But as the days wore on, a new, more familiar threat emerged. One morning she saw a rider approaching from the east, the direction of the nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings called Purgatory Flats. This was not a Shoshone warrior. This was a white man, and she recognized him instantly. Silas Kane. Kane was a man who fed on the misfortunes of others, a land speculator with a soul as barren as the Alkali Flats. He owned the saloon and most of the other businesses in town and held the deeds to half the homesteads in the basin. Deeds he'd acquired through foreclosure, intimidation, and outright violence. He'd wanted Jedediah's land from the start, coveting its reliable access to Cottonwood Creek. Since Jedediah's death, Kane had redoubled his efforts, sending his hired thugs to harass her, hoping to scare her off. He rode a big black gelding, flanked by two rough-looking men named Jeb and Roscoe. Kane pulled up just beyond the shimmering pile of Shoshone wealth, his piggy eyes taking in the scene with avaricious delight. Well, well, Mrs. Stone, he called out, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "Looks like you've been doing some trading with the locals. Come into some money, have we?" Cordelia stepped onto her porch, the Winchester held loosely in her hands. "What do you want, Kane?" Kane's eyes swept over the paint stallion, the pile of furs. "Just a neighborly visit. Heard some commotion out this way. Wanted to make sure everything was all right." His gaze lingered on the two Shoshone warriors who watched him with impassive hostility. "Looks like you've got yourself some house guests, or are they guards?" "They're not your concern," Cordelia said flatly. "Oh, but I think they are," Kane sneered. "I think you're in a heap of trouble, widow, and I'm the man to help you out of it. For a price, of course." He gestured expansively at her land. "Sign the deed over to me. I'll give you a fair price, enough to get you back east where you belong. I'll even deal with this." He waved a dismissive hand toward the Shoshone. "My land is not for sale," Cordelia said, her voice cold as steel. Kane's smile vanished. "You're a stubborn woman. This land ain't for a lone woman. First the savages, next the winter. It'll kill you. I'm offering you a clean way out. The only thing I want from you, Kane, is to see the back of you." Kane's face flushed with anger. "Have it your way. But don't come crying to me when these red devils decide to lift your scalp. They always want something in return." He spurred his horse, turning to leave, but his eyes were full of a greedy, calculating light. He had seen her isolation, her vulnerability, and the incredible wealth just sitting there for the taking. His visit left Cordelia with a fresh wave of dread. She was caught between two worlds, both of them hostile. That night the attack came, not from the Shoshone, but from Kane. Under the cover of a moonless sky, he and his men returned. They weren't interested in negotiation this time. The first sign of trouble was a flicker of orange against the side of the barn. Fire. "Tikna, wake up!" Cordelia shouted, grabbing the boy. She peered out the window. Flames were already licking up the dry wood of the barn wall. Absalom was braying in terror inside. Three figures on horseback were silhouetted against the growing blaze. Kane and his thugs. They were trying to burn her out. Cordelia's mind raced. The barn was lost. She had to save Absalom, and she had to protect the cabin. She threw a bucket of water onto the cabin wall nearest the fire, hoping to keep the sparks from catching. Suddenly, a rifle shot cracked through the night. Not from Kane's men. It came from the ridge where the Shoshone guards had been posted. One of Kane's men yelled in pain and surprise. From the darkness, Kiat appeared. He was on foot, moving with a silent, deadly grace that was terrifying to behold. He hadn't been at the guard post. He'd been closer, concealed in the rocks, watching. He carried his bow, an arrow already nocked. Kane and his men, caught completely by surprise, wheeled their horses around. "It's the savage! Kill him!" Kane roared. Jeb, the man who hadn't been hit, raised his pistol and fired wildly into the darkness. But Kiat was no longer there. He was a ghost, melting into the shadows. An arrow hissed out of the night and buried itself in Jeb's shoulder. He screamed and dropped his gun. Cordelia used the distraction. She burst from the cabin, Winchester in hand, and fired at Roscoe, the third man. The bullet tore through the pommel of his saddle. His horse, spooked by the fire and the gunshot, bucked him to the ground. Kiat materialized near the burning barn. Ignoring the flames, he moved to cut Absalom free. The mule, wild with fear, burst from the barn just as the roof began to collapse in a shower of sparks and embers. Kane, seeing his plan in ruins and his men incapacitated, let out a string of curses. He wasn't going to fight a Shoshone warrior in the dark. He fired one last panicked shot in Cordelia's direction before digging his spurs into his horse and galloping away into the night, abandoning his men. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning barn and the pained groans of Kane's hired guns. Kiat stood in the flickering firelight, his bow held loosely. He looked at the ruined barn, then at Cordelia. His expression was not one of friendship, but of shared crisis. His duty was to watch her, to ensure the insult to his family was not forgotten. That duty did not include letting her be killed by other white men. Her death would leave the debt of honor unsettled, a festering wound on their tribe's pride. Cordelia met his gaze, the heavy Winchester still warm in her hands. They were enemies, bound by a transaction she refused to accept. But for one violent, fiery moment, they had been allies. The two Shoshone guards emerged from the darkness and quickly disarmed and bound Jeb and Roscoe. Coyote walked over to Cordelia. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning her, checking for injury. He spoke, not in his own tongue, but in the same broken English the elder had used, though his was more practiced. These men, you know them. It wasn't a question. His name is Silas Kane, Cordelia said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. He wants my land. Kiat's eyes flickered toward the direction Kane had fled. He will return. I know. He then looked at the smoking ruin of her barn. He had saved her mule, but her winter supply of hay, her tools, everything was gone. Her chances of surviving the coming winter had just been reduced to almost nothing. He gave a sharp nod. You fought, he said. It was a simple statement of fact, but from him it sounded like the highest compliment. He had seen her fire the Winchester, seen her stand her ground. He had witnessed her strong heart for himself. He turned without another word and strode back into the darkness. The two guards dragged Kane's men away with them. Cordelia was left alone with Tikna, a terrified mule, and the smoldering ashes of her husband's dream. She was still a prisoner, still the subject of an unwanted bride price. But something had shifted. In the heat and violence of the attack, a sliver of understanding had been forged. She had seen the warrior behind the resentment, and he had seen the fighter behind the stubborn woman. Their war was not over, but a new, more dangerous enemy had united them in a fragile, unspoken alliance. And as Cordelia stared into the dying embers, she knew that Silas Kane would be back. And next time, he would not be satisfied with just burning a barn. The ashes of the barn were a cold, gray wound on the land, a daily reminder of how close Cordelia was to ruin. Winter was coming, and her hope for surviving it had gone up in smoke. A tense, watchful peace held with her Shoshone guards, but it was the peace of a jailer with his prisoner. The lavish bride price remained untouched, a constant, glittering insult. Coyote himself was a phantom. He never approached, but she felt his eyes on her. Occasionally she would find a freshly killed deer or a brace of rabbits left near her woodpile. It wasn't friendship. It was a cold, practical transaction. He was ensuring the object of his family's honor, and his personal burden, did not starve before the matter was settled. Tikna, the small boy at the center of this storm, became a fragile bridge between their worlds. He learned English words from Cordelia as she learned to read the silent warnings in Coyote's posture on the ridge. This fragile stalemate was shattered one bright afternoon. Cordelia was trying to salvage tools from the wreck of the barn, while Tikna chased grasshoppers near the creek bed. The attack came with a suddenness that stole her breath. Silas Kane and two new, ruthless-looking men burst from the cover of the gully. Before Cordelia could react, Kane had snatched Tikna, hauling the boy onto his horse and clamping a hand over his mouth. "We're going to have a new negotiation, widow," Kane shouted, his face a mask of triumph. He held the terrified boy in front of him like a shield. An arrow swift and silent as death flew from the ridge. It struck the man beside Kane, who gurgled once and tumbled from his saddle. Kiat stood there, a figure of righteous fury, his bow ready. But he was trapped. He couldn't shoot Kane without hitting his own brother. "That's your last shot, savage!" Kane screamed, pressing the barrel of a pistol to Tikna's head. "Another move and the boy dies. You, woman, drop the rifle." Cordelia's hands shook. She saw the torment on Kiat's face. Slowly she placed the Winchester on the ground. Kiat, seeing this, lowered his bow. "Good," Kane sneered. "Here's the deal. The savage and his warriors ride out and never return. The woman signs the deed to this land over to me. Do that, and maybe the boy lives." It was a blatant lie. Kane would never leave a witness. "He'll kill him anyway," Cordelia said, her voice a low warning meant for the ridge. She saw Kiat give the barest nod. He understood. Kane's mistake was focusing on the warrior on the hill. He saw Cordelia as a pawn, not a player. "All right, Kane," she said, raising her hands in surrender. "The deed is in the cabin. I'll get it." "My man goes with you," Kane grunted, gesturing to his remaining thug. Cordelia turned and walked to the cabin, the hired gun on her heels. Her heart hammered. This had to work. Inside, she went to the small wooden chest where she kept her papers. The man stood in the doorway, blocking her escape. As she reached into the chest, her fingers bypassed the papers and closed around the cold, heavy grip of Jedediah's old Colt Peacemaker. In one explosive motion, she spun, firing the pistol. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. The gunman was thrown backward out of the doorway, his face a caricature of surprise. The gunshot shattered Kane's concentration. For a single fatal second, he glanced toward the cabin. It was the only opening Kiat needed. He loosed not an arrow, but a rock from a hidden sling, thrown with stunning force. It struck Kane's gun hand, sending the pistol flying. Kane howled in pain, his grip on Tikna faltering. The boy seized his chance, biting down hard on the man's wrist. Kane cursed and shoved him away. As Tikna scrambled toward her, Cordelia burst from the cabin, firing the Colt at Kane. The shot missed, but it sent his horse into a panic. From the ridge, Kiat and his warrior were charging down, a silent, deadly wave of vengeance. Kane, seeing his plan in ruins, wheeled his horse and fled, abandoning his dead. Kiat didn't give chase. He slid from his pony and ran to Tikna, sweeping the trembling child into his arms. He held his brother tightly, his cold facade completely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective love. He looked up at Cordelia over Tikna's head. The hostility in his eyes was gone. In its place was a deep, complicated respect. She had saved his brother not once, but twice, first with brute strength, and now with cunning and courage. That evening, Kite came to her cabin. He came alone and unarmed. He gestured to the lavish bride price that still glittered in the twilight. "This," he said, his English slow and deliberate, "was the honor of my father. It was a chain for you, and for me." He walked to the magnificent paint stallion, took its lead rope, and handed it to Cordelia. He went to the furs and took one single perfect buffalo robe, laying it gently on her porch. He picked up the Henry rifle and leaned it against her wall. "A horse of spirit for a woman of spirit," he stated. "A robe for warmth, a rifle for protection. The debt of my family is paid." He looked her directly in the eye. "My debt is my own." He reached into his own hair and untied a single, intricately braided lock. At its end was a single, perfect hawk's feather. It was his personal talisman. He held it out to her. "My name is Kiate," he said, as if for the first time. "It means hawk that flies alone." He looked from her face to the vast open sky. But sometimes, even a hawk needs a place to land. He was not offering a price, he was offering a gift. He was withdrawing his father's custom and offering his own respect. Warrior to warrior, soul to soul. He was asking for nothing, only acknowledging her for who she was. Cordelia looked at the feather, then into his eyes, which now held a quiet, profound understanding. Slowly she reached out and took it from his hand. Her fingers brushed his. In that touch, the war between them ended. And a new story, one not written by pride or custom, but by shared survival, was just beginning. Cordelia Stone's story didn't end with a wedding march or a signed deed. It ended and began again, with a single hawk's feather. Her journey shows us that the Wild West was more than just a battle for land. It was a profound, often brutal struggle for understanding between worlds that live by different codes. What began as a terrifying obligation transformed through courage and shared adversity into a bond of mutual respect between two of the frontier's most unlikely allies. If this tale of the unforgiving West, of a lone woman's grit and a proud warrior's honor captured your imagination, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a true frontier drama, and most importantly, subscribe for more tales from the edge of civilization. Your support allows us to keep these powerful stories alive. Let us know in the comments. What do you think Kiat meant by his final words? Was it an offer of protection, of friendship, or something more? We'd love to hear your thoughts.